want a free hotel room?
So what time are we starting? Sure.
2:30.
Okay, let's just get started.
All right, if I can please have your attention. I guess we have a hotel key left in the restroom. If anybody's missing their hotel key.
It's for the Marriott Hotel. So if you lost your hotel key in the male bathroom, so male, or, do you want a free hotel? Yeah.
So that was my colleague Rich. He was here. It's just outside. Yeah, that's what first thing I did too. Panels present one after the other,
Okay.
and then we take the screen up and they can sit here.
Should I introduce them first and
Yeah.
ask them to sit, and then one by one?
But they can't sit here because it'll be in the eye.
Okay.
So
What should we
we
do?
call them one by one. We
Okay.
have three panelists. We call them one by one, right? Introduce them to make the presentation, and then we put the screen up and they sit down.
Sure.
Make sense?
All right. For the next part, we have a panel discussion. Oh, sorry, I have. So our first panelist is Dr. Mary Trudeau. Dr. Mary is a professional engineer specializing in water resources and urban infrastructure. For 15 years, she managed maintenance and operation portfolios for municipal potable, wastewater, and stormwater systems. More recently, she has been a consultant providing policy and program advice to government and environmental non-government organizations. She is a published author in the Journal of Hydrology and Ecohydrology, and she teaches part-time at the University of Ottawa. Thank you.
Great. So good afternoon. Yes, Trudeau from Ottawa. No, not related. My mom's name is Margaret, though. We call her Margaret Trudeau the First. So this is a picture of the Don Valley Parkway in Toronto, 2014. And just to sort of kick things off, I'm going to focus on land use and the planning aspects, and I'll bring it around to climate change. See if I can get, which one is it? Oh, okay. So I was wondering, what are the flood risks in Newfoundland? Being based in Ontario, I'm not as familiar with it, so I'll just touch on that. And I did some research over a number of years on urbanization and flow trends. I'll give you just the Coles notes on that, and then some conclusions and implications. So this is the Don Valley Parkway 2018, flooded again. So the question, where is the 100-year floodplain and where will it be in the future? So these are two stats from Newfoundland government websites. Flooding in Newfoundland is mostly caused by heavy rainfalls, and the stats are about 3/4 is rainfall related, so coastal flooding, ice jam, snow melt. There are lots of reasons, but like I guess most places it is the pluvial flooding that is an issue. And in terms of land use, so this is a statistic from an AMEC 2012 report, but it was in a 2014 update, where of 39 community flood watersheds that were assessed, only one didn't experience a loss in forest cover, and the others experienced loss of forest cover in the range of 4 to 28%. So I'm going to be talking specifically about urbanization, which is the most drastic form of land use change if you go from forest to urban, but even taking trees off the landscape fundamentally changes the way water interacts with that landscape. And if you've ever been camping and tried to, burn new wood, you'll know how much water a tree can hold. So the research that I did was within the Great Lakes Basin, the Toronto area, and I wanted to choose an area that had gone through drastic urbanization because I wasn't sure what was going to show up in terms of trends. So I was looking at actual data. So this is empirical data, sort of just the facts, ma'am, type of things, actual numbers from hydrologic records to develop empirical models. So the limitation of empirical models is that they really only fit that location. The advantage is that there's no fudge factors in terms of some of the modeling assumptions that you have to make. And I was also looking specifically from the end of May to the middle of November, so just rain-fed, so that it wouldn't be confused or confounded by rain on snow, frozen ground, that kind of thing. So there were 27 watersheds in 11 river systems. The hydrologic data was on 15-minute increments, so 15-minute increments over a 42-year period, and the rain data was in 1-hour increments. So I looked at trends through time in the Don and the Humber, not Newfoundland's Humber, but Toronto's Humber. And then I looked across an urban gradient to see, how it spelled out with changes in urbanization. And then I looked at fish richness, which I'm not going to be able to talk to you about just for time's sake, but I was interested in why fish disappear from urban watersheds. So the watersheds range from about 38 to 800 square kilometers, so roughly 100 times smaller than the Churchill. And the urban cover ranged from virtually unurbanized to 87% urban. And agricultural drainage practices also changed. So some of the changes, may have been because tile drainage practices, for example, changed. For the urban land use, the older records weren't available anywhere other than from aerial photographs that we purchased from NRCan. And GIS students digitized the urban area. So in the Rouge from 1974 to 1988, you can see that sort of that lower fifth of the watershed filled in just within those, decade and a half period. So in terms of temporal trends, so in the Don and the Humber, in 42 years, there was a 45% increase in total runoff between the end of May and the middle of November. And when you look at the urban gradient, which that's the curve fit, the statistical curve fit to the data points, basically as you urbanize, you get more total runoff. And the thing that showed up in the models was that those changes start very, very early. So less than 4% urban cover, you start to see the signal in total runoff and also flow rate, flow acceleration, which is the rate of change in flow. The kicker is that during that 42-year period, there were no trends in rainfall. So I looked at total rainfall, frequency of rain events, maximum intensity, total hours with rain, rain event depth per event, and there was no trend. So there's high natural variability in precipitation, which is why one of the reasons it's problematic to get a statistical signal. So any of these flow trends occurred prior to a detectable change in precipitation. So there were air temperature trends, so it was clear that the climate was changing when you look at the air temperature, but that signal in the water, there's more inertia, I guess, in the water cycle, and more natural variability. So that change was showing up before the climate trends. So flood risk mapping has to include estimates of future land use change. And we've talked about that already today, but this just shows you how much change that is, how much potential change there is, and the fact that it's cumulative. Little lot over time, over a 42-year period, makes an enormous difference, and it's resulted in a much higher risk for flooding in the Don Valley Parkway, for example, than there would have been had that been a natural watershed facing the climate change issue. So loss of vegetation, changes in agricultural practices are also factors. very low levels of urban cover initiate hydrologic change, and mitigation requires a watershed scale approach. So low impact development, these kinds of things, we have to look at a watershed scale. And if you're only dealing lot by lot, you may miss some of the mitigation because you have no new roads, for example, coming into subdivisions, and those roads are also going to change beyond the scale of a subdivision or a new parking lot, whatever the scale is. So hydrologic stability, or stationarity as it's called in the literature, in highly urbanized watersheds was lost before climate change effects were manifested. So we already had a problem with flood mapping even before we start layering on climate change. And it's just really important, especially at the municipal level, I believe, to take that on board, because it's the little changes that are made over time, and then you're adding this risk of climate change on top. So, you know, we talked a little bit, not much, but a little bit about pre equals post. Pre-flows equal post-flows. Well, pre-when? When's your baseline? Because if your baseline is you know, already in a developed area and you have additional roads and networks outside of that area, then you may be being a bit, I guess, not conservative enough in terms of identifying the pre-development flows that you're aiming for a developer to meet. So, and long-term data are needed. You know, we talk about 5 years, 10 years being long-term. Well, 42 years. I don't know what the flows were before, but you know, clearly it was already agricultural. So we're not even talking about when there were trees on this part of the land, because it was, you know, several hundred years ago. So that's it. Thanks.
Okay, our next panelist is Chris Roll. Chris Roll is a senior policy advisor with Insurance Bureau of Canada, IBC. Chris Roll has over 20 years of experience in the public and private sectors. She has served as a political assistant for the Premier of Ontario, in addition to various roles for both MPPs and in the Caucus Research Office. Following her time in the public sector, she held a management position with a property and casualty insurance brokerage, as well as a government relation role with Cooperators Insurance. Having joined IBC's policy department in 2011, Chris works as part of the Climate Change and Catastrophic Risk team with a focus on climate change adaptation. She is viewed as the in-house specialist on the topic of flood. Chris is a member of CSA Technical Standard Development Committees for lot level and community flood resiliency, as well as the NRC Steering Committee on Flood Resilience of Buildings and the Environment Climate Change Canada External Panel on Climate Services. If you can please join us.
Thanks very much. Okay, just get the thing working properly. The middle one here.
Just moving forward, place this one.
Okay. Oops. Okay, sorry about that. Okay. I'm Chris Roll, and I represent Insurance Bureau of Canada, or IBC, the National Trade Association of approximately 200 property and casualty insurers that offer home, automobile, and business insurance across Canada. My role today is to provide some context on how insurers are using mapping to assess flood risks and why it is important that they're able to do so. Insurers make use of maps and models to assess both hazard and risk for fluvial, pluvial, and coastal flooding. Insurers are the front lines when severe weather hits, and we know the tremendous toll that extreme weather can take. In the 1990s, the Canadian property and casualty insurance industry averaged about $400 million a year in catastrophic losses. In the past decade, however, we have surpassed $1 billion annually, except for a year, except one. But in 2018, we hit $2 billion. Water-related losses have formed the bulk of these costs. Governments also face financial strain. Lost tax revenues and demands for relief and reconstruction place enormous financial strains on governments. On average, disasters increase governments' budget deficits by 25%. Properties and economies with high insurance penetration recover much more quickly after a natural disaster than properties that rely on governments for their recovery. Insurers may not be able to prevent an extreme weather event, but if through better financial management we can prevent it from becoming a disaster or catastrophe, that could make a real difference. Part of the value of the work we do at IBC is to quantify for decision makers the financial impacts associated with not mitigating risk. Insurance provides financial security and predictability by providing a financial vehicle to transfer risk from the public arena, that would be governments and taxpayers, to private capital markets. By spreading the cost of risk over time and diversifying it across communities, insurance or reinsurance is one tool in the larger mitigation toolbox, which brings us to the importance of risk assessment. In Canada, insurance coverage for some kinds of water damage, such as sewer backup, has been available for a long time. But residential overland flooding, when the water flows across your lawn and into your basement from a river or from the sky, has historically been considered an uninsurable peril here. There are several factors at play, but one of the most important was that insurers did not understand the risk. Canada lacked accurate, up-to-date flood maps. You see, insurers require maps that identify flood risk as well as flood hazard. Risk requires the presence of hazard, but also the exposure of people or assets to that hazard. Flood hazard maps, a traditional approach in land use planning outside the risk management world, identify where the water goes, but not what damage it may cause. And these maps mostly only measure riverine flooding. Flood risk maps, on the other hand, identify where the water goes and what it may affect: the homes, the businesses, the infrastructure. Insurers require this added layer of data, including property values, to properly assess risk and develop responsive products. IBC contracted for a customized flood model based on what was the most up-to-date available local climatic, hydrological, and hydraulic data to assess fluvial, pluvial, and storm surge risk. This mapping helped spur others to bring flood models of their own to market, and with these new flood risk assessment tools, insurers began offering overland flood insurance. Now this coverage is widely available to Canadians, and an important step has been taken in reducing the gap between insured losses and economic losses. As groundbreaking as these risk models have been, they are only as good as the input data. Large-scale flood risk models used by Canada's insurance sector currently use low-resolution topographic data as inputs, and also give limited consideration to flood mitigation infrastructure or defense measures that have been implemented by Canadian municipalities. Municipalities rightfully want investments in resilient infrastructure to earn a return on investment in terms of increased availability and affordability of insurance for de-risked communities. In Canada, however, we lack approaches for modeling the resilience performance of mitigating infrastructure. As well, it is difficult to aggregate this data efficiently across jurisdictions and incorporate it into third-party models to price risk. IBC has been working with the Canadian Water Network to explore through pilot projects what would happen if the input data were improved. For our joint study, pilot communities provided better defense data, and NRCan was able to provide updated terrain maps. A key conclusion from that study is that better terrain data is hugely important. I'm confident that as the models become more accurate, insurers will be able to do an even better job of transferring risk and closing the gap between insured and economic losses. Insurers see ourselves as partners, along with other financial enterprises, governments, and academia, in a whole-of-society approach to enhancing resilience. Risk transfer solutions can play an important role in reducing the economic costs borne by governments and directly by individuals. We are committed to reducing the insurance gap.
Thanks, Chris. Our next presenter is David Brown, Water Resources Department Head, Associate Principal with KGS Group. Please welcome.
Okay, thanks again. So a short talk here. I guess it was asked this question: how flood risk mapping and its derivatives, like flood forecasting systems, development restrictions, etc., are tools for planning and public safety for committees or communities. So I guess first, flood risk maps. There's actually many types, and there's many different uses, and often they can be used interchangeably, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. We got flood risk maps, floodplain maps, inundation maps, flood hazard maps, and they can look many different ways. A couple of these you've seen on the bottom here already. One on the top right there, that's an example of a dam break inundation map. And then the other one on the top is a municipal regulatory floodplain map for City of Thunder Bay. So flood risk maps, floodplain maps, really they're identifying two main concepts. What's flood prone, and an indication of severity. Now that's not necessarily directly shown on the map, but it can be inferred from it by the data or information that you put on that map. And how can the mapping products inform community and stakeholders? We've talked a lot about municipalities here, communities. Don't want to forget about stakeholders too, though, right? Highways, they're a stakeholder. You could have utilities, telephone systems, stakeholders. First Nations, Indigenous communities. So what can this information help? Development planning, we've talked a lot about that. Business continuity, haven't really talked about much of that today, but it's important. And it's important in terms of the communities as well. Critical infrastructure, where is it? Where should it be? And emergency planning. One of the things that I just highlight here, I'm involved with the Canadian Dam Association, and they're putting out a new bulletin. It's going to be coming out in the next couple months, just in terms of guiding dam owners with emergency management. And three kind of main focuses are consistency, collaboration, and engagement. A lot of it focuses around the entity that makes the flood map. Well, let's say we do that in silos a lot now, or in the past. We give community a map and say, hey, there's your map. Do with it what you need. So we have to get better at, as the people that make these maps, at what is the purpose for this map? What does the end user need? And how can we make that information readily available, easily accessible? Because let's face it, oftentimes we're in an emergency situation, we need that. So forecasting system benefits, well, I talked about one earlier, forecasting system, but just to highlight the benefits, mentioned about this morning, the community caught a little bit of off guard. Flood level is somewhat unpredictable, and the flood happened in the early hours of the morning. We heard about difficult evacuations from Paula. So this was difficult evacuations, helicopter evacuation in the middle of the night for family and pets. And we have to also recognize that not only is there damage physical, but there's a lot of stress involved, and there's a lot of physical and mental stress that goes with being flooded. And it's not just when the flood happens, it's after the flood, recovery, a lot of stress there. So forecasting systems can allow for better planning, warning for flooding, and as well for evacuation. We can plan things better. Example just of, thought of how could I show some examples? I pulled some of this information from the CDA committee I'm working with. It was a tabletop exercise. We heard that earlier. Tabletop exercise. We have emergency plans. They sit on the shelf. Well, we got to practice, right? This doesn't look like much, but OPG was practicing a tabletop with flood levels. They engaged the dam owner themselves, right? The regulator, the community, the first responders, and they simulated the flood, and then they simulated the dam breach. They worked together, and then they started identifying critical infrastructure. It doesn't look like much. A little shed. That was a critical communications infrastructure, and it was right in the middle of the floodplain, right where it's going to get flooded, regardless of the dam breach. So they identified that vulnerability, and they actually worked together to remedy that. The utility moved that out of the floodplain because that was going to be a critical piece of infrastructure for response. So the floodplain mapping helped them do that. Another example, Kaministiquia River near Thunder Bay. There was 2 different flood events, one in 2008, and when they were looking at the flood event happened, resulted in a lot of evacuations upstream, and they were looking at their floodplain mapping. And this bridge is a significant restriction, impediment. It actually created a lot of flooding upstream because of that impediment. So involvement with the stakeholders, assessment with the flood mapping, they did some what-if scenarios. They found that if they removed the restriction, they'd actually have less flooding upstream, less hazard. And lo and behold, after they did that, another flood came along 4 years in 2012. Pretty much the same flow, 0 evacuations, because they had worked through some improvements in resiliency by removing that restriction. And they did here look at what, if that restriction would have caused backwater, they did look and say, if we take the restriction out, what happens downstream? So just kind of some key messages here that I pull out is, there's numerous benefits. Just highlighted a couple of them here. There's more we could talk about, but there are a lot of benefits for public planning and safety. And I'd say community and stakeholder engagement is critical. Work as a team. That collaboration lead to reduced flooded area, improved development planning, increased business continuity, and improved emergency response evacuation. At the end of the day, it comes down to improving our community resilience. So that's what I had.
Great, thank you. I'm going to ask all our panelists to please take your seat in front. Okay, and the floor is open to questions, discussions for our panelists.
Please don't be shy.
Thank you. One of the problems I've always seen with flooding in particular is that flood emergency reimbursement from the federal end at least is often restricted to replacing exactly what was destroyed in the flood. So if you have a 4-foot diameter culvert on a road, you can put back a 4-foot diameter culvert. If you take a look and say, that's no longer adequate, we need a 6-foot one, that's not covered. And is there a way, either through the insurance process or through regulations, to get that roadblock to an improved situation amended?
It should
Sure.
be live.
Does this work this way? Okay. In theory, there is actually a way to do that. Canada is a signatory of the Sendai Agreement, and that is a disaster risk reduction agreement that is signed by different countries. And one of the key principles within that agreement is the idea of build back better. And if you look at the federal disaster financial assistance arrangements rules, which are, as you say, very restrictive in many, many ways, they do have a section in there that allows for communities to build back better. And there is a provision in there for at least a certain percentage of the rebuild to be done that way. But it probably involves 1,006 forms and other such things. But there is a mechanism. It's just not widely used at this point. I think it's something we're going to see a lot more of.
Hi. My question is regarding the insurance. Ma'am, here. Right here. Okay. So if a house is already on the floodplain and the flood risk assessment map category is that it is vulnerable, so the insurance premium is likely to go up. I mean, if I got you correct, because the programs try to shift the cost or the economic burden from the government agencies to the private. So would it be more burden on the common people?
Yes, insurance is tied to risk in the same way that if you were driving a car and you had 47 accidents, you would pay more for your insurance than the person who had none. If you live on a floodplain, your insurance is likely to, and not just floodplains, because there's also pluvial flood risk. If you live in an area where there is risk, that is going to be something that impacts on premiums. We know that for a certain percentage of people, those at the very highest risk, that is going to be a significant financial hit. And we are working alongside the federal and provincial governments, and really as part of a broader whole of society initiative, to try to come up with a solution for the financial management of risk for those highest risk individuals, the ones that would have a difficult time either obtaining private market insurance or for whom that insurance would be functionally unaffordable. And so these are active conversations that are underway at this time. And we're hoping as an industry that there will be a solution, because in order to provide that continuum of options for people to address their risk.
Somebody mentioned it before about you have a house in a floodplain, it floods, they have to rebuild their house, they get emergency kind of funding, and then it happens again, the house gets flooded. I'm just wondering, across Canada or in other jurisdictions, have you come across, or what examples do you have of how to keep people, like once they're flooded, like, you know, it's insanity just doing the same thing over and over again. But how do you get people out of the floodplain? Have you, is there like successful ways to do that?
We're seeing a lot of interesting things happening across the country. Firstly, the response on rebuilding varies. In the United States, their NFIP program will frequently rebuild properties over and over and over again in exactly the same spot, in exactly the same way, and then the predictable things happen. There are ways that people can mitigate their risks. There's a new CSA standard out there that provides guidance for folks in terms of doing either dry or wet mitigation efforts. But I think it is something that we have to deal with as a society, and provincial governments have been starting to think about it and realize this is something that needs to be addressed, whether it was in High River after the 2013 floods, or in Quebec, as we just recently saw in the Gatineau area. Governments are considering options like buyouts and things of that nature to help people, especially those in the when, not if part of the flood zone, to get themselves out of harm's way. As was mentioned earlier, flooding is an extremely stressful thing. And nobody wants to go through multiple, you go through one flood and it's bad, but very few people want to do it over and over again.
Yeah, are we on here too? Just Manitoba perspective, and there's actually a lot of Manitobans that get flooded year after year after year. When houses are flooded from whatever reason, and they get rebuilt, there's usually levels, they have to be built above flood protection level, okay? So they don't just rebuild the same. They will rebuild to a higher standard. They will rebuild to a level of protection. How the funding mechanisms work exactly with the government, I'm not exactly sure. But there is also flood proofing grants that were available for people who lived in floodplain in terms of raising the foundation or building a ring dike around the community. In the area of southern Manitoba, south of Winnipeg, it's glacial Lake Agassiz. It's flat as a pancake. And when it floods miles and miles and miles wide. It's nothing to take a drive south of Winnipeg and see houses perched up on individual hills that are sometimes up to 20 feet high. Or you can see the roof of the house because the earth dike around the house is just as high as the first story. So there is example in Manitoba where you get flooded, you rebuild to a higher level of protection. The government of Manitoba has recently, in the last 2 years, switched over to a 200-year level of protection instead of a 100-year. Now, some of the challenges is in certain areas is what is that level? Has to be defined still. Other examples, Red River, just at the mouth of Lake Winnipeg, very prone to ice jams. Year after year, houses were getting flooded from ice jams. So the government actually looked and bought them out. Relocation. Not an easy thing, usually last resort. First resorts are floodproofing if you can. Well, first resort maybe relocation, voluntary. Floodproofing, because regardless how people, if they flood, there's a reason they're there typically. They like their home, they like their place. It may flood, but they still like it. And then relocation buyout could be the last.
Hi, Mary. I have a question for you. I was fascinated to hear about your PhD work on watershed land use ratios because some part of my own PhD was on a similar approach, but for a different end purpose, and looking at water quality as it came out of watersheds on the east coast of Nova Scotia. And we've known for quite a period of time now that the ratio of land use and land cover from urban to natural forest to the percentage of wetlands and the amount of buffered shorelines has an effect on both, as you've pointed out, both on water quantity and also on water quality. I've spent a lot of my work looking at how you translate science into better and more insightful adaptation at the local level. But my question to you is, why are we missing the boat in not applying this kind of information on the upstream end of knowledge for what we are doing when we do watershed planning and when we look at even the recommendations coming out of flood studies and that.
Well, is this working?
Should
Yes?
go.
Okay. So there's at least two reasons we're missing the boat. One is the insidious nature of cumulative effects. You know, it is one parking lot, one driveway, one subdivision at a time, and those take place, you know, those are developed over time. Within 20 years, you have a vastly different runoff. 20 years is a long time in our culture anyway, it's a long time. So, and this isn't only for watershed development, it's cumulative effects in general. So cumulative effects of resource extraction, for example, in the north, and not just we in Canada, but globally, we're struggling with how to measure that. At what point is an effect too much, and then who bears the responsibility for remedying the future effects? Because the next person coming in, say building a subdivision, is it equitable to hold them responsible for the cumulative effects in the previous 20 to 50 years? So the insidious nature of cumulative effects is one of the problems. And I think with respect to municipal levels, there is an enormous pressure on municipalities to develop. It's the source of financing. Your tax base has to increase. So I think there's an underestimation at the senior government levels of the capacity and the political will at the municipal level to deal with imposing very strict development guidelines. You know, the political influence of developers is massive. I'm not sure about Newfoundland specifically, but I know in Ontario it's massive. And you have the financing on top of it. So I don't believe that the burden for addressing that development pressure can rest only at the municipal level. They're at the front end, but there has to be some, you know, guidance standards, you know, very, very definitive requirements set at a more senior level that is not as influenced by the local development community.
If I can add a little something there, the federal government has started a process of updating a variety of codes and standards to introduce the idea of climate resiliency. And one of the new standards that's being developed will be coming out at the end of this year. And it is a standard for flood resilient new communities. So it really does speak directly to that question of development. It looks at planning. It looks at the things that a community ought to do if it's trying to embed flood resiliency into that community. So I encourage you all to pay attention to your news feeds, and hopefully you'll find it useful to your needs.
And just, I guess, a question from that is, what is a new community? And you know, what baseline do you set? So there are all kinds of technical questions and scientific questions and equity questions that municipal councils will need to face. You know, are you going to protect only the new ones? I mean, you're going to have some blowback from constituents if the new communities don't flood and the existing ones do. So, you know, it's not simple, it's not straightforward, but you know, it's starting.
Yeah, we have to address both that sort of legacy risk that we've developed over time, and also give some thought to new communities, but hopefully it's useful guidance.
This question is for Dr. Trudeau specifically. I was wondering if you could comment on some of the fish richness aspects of your study that you weren't able to get to in your presentation.
This question.
Oh.
Yeah, so I was looking, fish richness was actually what inspired the research. because we have this issue of urban stream syndrome, where at about 10% urbanization, the diversity drops like a stone. And urban stream syndrome is, that's the term used in the literature. You know, temperature changes, water quality changes, the flow changes. So I just wanted to look at what potential role flow would change. And so I had a database of fish going back to the 40s, and there's all kinds of problems with fish data. If you just look at the raw numbers, diversity increases dramatically, because in the 80s, what used to be a minnow is now, you know, a river red horse or whatever. Like, we differentiated minnows. So just looking at the straight numbers, you don't get an impression of just how dramatic the diversity decline has been. But what I looked at was flow acceleration. So with the 15-minute increments, I could look at the rate of change of flow increase, so how fast the flow is increasing. And that is actually an increase in flow acceleration is more strongly associated with poor fish richness than urban cover. So this idea that, you know, if you urbanize, you change all kinds of things, and you have problems, and you do. You know, trout can't survive in above a certain water temperature. But because flow acceleration is more strongly associated, it means that it could be just the flow itself is, you know, it's blowing fish out of the river, you know, they can't adapt. So when it rains, you know, the signal in a natural system, there's slow signals in the river that will indicate, you know, a fish needs to shelter. Whereas by the time you're highly urbanized, it starts to rain and immediately you have that flow response. So, you know, it's an area for additional research, whether that problem is direct, you know, for example, blowing fish basically downstream, or if it's indirect in that it, you know, it blows out the nests or just the substrate. So, and it could be both. Those aren't mutually exclusive, but there's something about the increase in rate of flow that is definitely contributing to that decline in fish richness. So thank you for asking that question.
Question regarding insurance rates, I guess. Federally, there's a new climate lens process for infrastructure projects, and there's going to be one in this province as well. So projects that go through a climate lens process that includes a climate resiliency assessment and mitigation measures get built in, or design changes to accommodate and reduce risk. Will there be any preferred insurance rate options for projects that go through that process? Do you know?
To it a little bit in my remarks, and that is there's a huge challenge getting information from the municipal level up to the models that are being used by the folks who do modeling for insurers. And we're trying to find ways with the Canadian Water Network of breaking that log jam, making it so that the information flows a lot more directly. We know it's an issue. We know that terrain mapping is a huge benefit, but when it comes to things like flood defenses and things of that nature, you really have to get sub 10 meter resolution in order to really pick that up in the models. So as the terrain mapping gets better, the information from communities in terms of what they're doing in terms of resiliency, whether it is direct flood defenses or climate change plans. And honestly, it's not just having a plan, it's implementing the plan that matters. So hopefully we'll find a way past it, but we're still in early stages right now, I think.
I got a follow-up question to Dave about the exercise you talked about, where they noticed that the communication shed was in the floodplain. I've seen this happen with other utilities too. I've seen power stations in the floodplain. So why does it need an exercise to identify that? Why aren't utilities able to see that when you see the flood risk mapping?
question, good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer exactly for why it's still happening. I think what happens with society is our memories are short. We have flooding, and then we usually react. And then funding starts to flow to mitigate those flooding damages. Thinking back to, I'll use the Assiniboine River in Manitoba, 2011, huge flooding. Flooding lasted for 3 months. Like that's one thing, we can pretty much see our flood coming and have time to prepare in Manitoba, but not always. And when that flood was at its peak, then we got huge rains and it just put it over the top. But what had happened was there were dikes that were ignored for 30 years. And so they were in such a state of disrepair that the short memory, or maybe it's the false sense of comfort being protected, led us to building infrastructure maybe where we should have thought about it a little better, right? Sometimes these utilities or buildings, they're placed for many other reasons, and being in an inundated area is not one of them.
I'd like to do a follow-up on that. I spent 35 years working largely with engineering firms on development on the East Coast, and I can say there are two also problems: low bid tender and CAD space. Because when you work in CAD space, you're working on the system, you got a 0.0 base floor elevation, and it's not tied to topography generally. I have had so many projects that when they came by my desk, because I'm a landscape architect, so I'm tying everything to topography. And I'm looking at it and going, do you guys really think this through? So where we have differentiated into the disciplines of engineering, so one person has one page of a set of drawings, they're not always connecting through. So the electrical or the utilities guy who put that in that place may not have even looked at the civils drawing for that. And it's one of the reasons why, as we get further along, the need for interdisciplinary teams on even the smallest kinds of projects that we've got going forward is really seriously important. And it's one of the questions I have for the Climate Lens process, because right now, loosely identified in the guidance is the expert you should talk to is an engineer, no discipline specified, a planner, and a biologist. I am a biologist, and I would not like to see a lot of my biological colleagues reviewing projects for their effectiveness or the issues associated with Climate Lens. But there are no architects or landscape architects, no urban designers, there are no foresters. There's just like a whole range of disciplines that have been left out. There's no sociologists, which is like really important.
Any other questions? I have one more question for the panel. From the point of view of planning, what about giving space back to the river? What about retreating? What about taking land and turning it back to natural landscapes? Has the panel seen any examples of that? Anything to encourage that?
After the 1997 flood on the Red River that flooded Grand Forks, North Dakota, and then up into Winnipeg, they weren't really prepared in Grand Forks. And they had a lot of development right down to the river. And I don't know if you can remember, there would have been a picture at one point showing the downtown burning when the streets were flooded. So they had really bad situation down there. After the flood went through and the studies were done, the city decided to do exactly what you said. They took development off of the main river through the center of the city. They built flood walls and they turned it into parkland. So there's an example of returning the land back to moving the people out.
I think wherever we're starting to see governments talking about or implementing some sort of strategic retreat, and that really is the sort of far end of the mitigation scale for folks whose risk can't be mitigated in any other way, those lands do largely go back to parklands and things like that. I think some of the buying out in Gatineau, I think there was something yesterday in the CBC talking, an article talking about how those lands, those properties have been demolished. It's turning back gradually into parklands and things.
And there's also the example, I think Chris mentioned it briefly, was in High River, where they have retreated from that floodplain. And it's interesting because I think the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers is backtracking on, you know, their decades of putting concrete in rivers. They're returning, you know, natural flows. It's happening more in the U.S., I think, than in Canada, but gradually, you know, there's a recognition that the river belongs to the river, not, you know, and the more concrete you put in, the more downstream problems you're going to have. So it's going to take some time, though.
If there are no more questions, just we'll end the panel discussion. Thank you.
All right, it's been a wonderful workshop and wonderful day. Unfortunately, Hassan Khan couldn't stay with us for delivering his closing remarks. So I, on behalf of Department of Municipal Affairs and Environment, would like to thank you, all of you. We appreciate you taking the time off your busiest schedule and joining us today. Our special thanks also goes to our speakers today for their spectacular talks, and also to our volunteers without whom this wouldn't be possible. We are also very thankful to Natural Resources Canada for providing funding. And this has been our first time organizing this workshop. So we hope you found this workshop to be productive. And we would like to receive your feedbacks and comments. Unfortunately, we don't have the screen here. But if you can provide us your feedbacks and comments through our email address, waterinvestigations@gov.nl. Now I can show it perhaps. No, it's not coming. All right, hopefully we hear from you soon. And thank you all once again, and have a wonderful rest of the day.